For centuries, alien scholars studied ancient stone tablets found across the galaxy. These tablets were discovered on dead planets, drifting space ruins, and buried moons with no atmosphere. Every time one was found, it caused great excitement. Scientists gathered, records were made, and theories were shared across star systems. The tablets were always old, older than any known civilization, and they all looked similar no matter where they were found. Each tablet was made of a dark, stone-like material that never cracked or decayed. Time, radiation, and even extreme heat did nothing to them. This alone made them valuable. But what truly puzzled scholars were the symbols carved into their surfaces. The symbols were sharp, clean, and arranged in long rows. They did not look random, yet no one could understand them. Many species tried. Linguists compared the symbols to every known language. Cultural experts searched for meaning in art, religion, or tradition. Historians argued that the tablets were ceremonial objects, maybe used in rituals or memorials. Others claimed they were only decorations, carved by an ancient species with a strange sense of beauty. Over time the debate slowed. The same arguments repeated again and again, and no new answers appeared. Slowly interest faded. The tablets were moved from research labs to storage vaults. They were labeled, archived, and cataloged. Young scholars were warned not to waste time on them. Professors said the tablets were a solved mystery, not because they were understood but because they were believed to be meaningless. The symbols were officially classified as non-linguistic cultural markings. That phrase ended most discussions. The Galactic Academic Coalition agreed. With thousands of active civilizations and endless new discoveries, they decided it was better to focus on useful knowledge. Star travel, energy systems, medicine, these were worth studying. Old stones with strange carvings were not. When humans joined the coalition, they were still new to interstellar society. Their technology was impressive for their age, but compared to ancient spacefaring species, humans were considered inexperienced. Many alien scholars believed humans were too emotional, too curious, and too focused on their own history. Still, humans were allowed to observe and assist. One of the first human delegations visited the Grand Archive Station, a massive structure floating near the center of coalition space. Inside were records of extinct civilizations, lost worlds, and forgotten discoveries. Entire halls were filled with artifacts that no one studied anymore. Deep inside the station, far from the busy research levels, was the tablet archive. The archive was quiet. Lights were dimmed to preserve materials, and long rows of shelves stretched into the distance. Tablets rested in transparent cases, each one marked with symbols and identification codes. Most had not been touched in decades. Alien scholars passed through the archive only when required. They treated it as a place of duty, not curiosity. To them, the tablets were old problems without solutions. When the human delegation toured the station, the guide briefly mentioned the tablets. He spoke in a bored tone, explaining that they came from a lost civilization and held no useful data. The humans listened politely, but they noticed the guide moved on quickly, eager to show more important discoveries. Among the humans was a quiet man who noticed the tablets more than the others. He did not speak much and he did not interrupt the guide. He only slowed his steps as they passed the shelves, his eyes following the symbols carved into the stone. The symbols looked simple. Straight lines. Angles. Repeated shapes. No curves, no faces, no images of animals or stars. Just clean marks, carved with purpose. The man felt something strange. Not excitement, not fear, just a sense of familiarity. He had seen shapes like these before long ago in books about ancient human history. But he said nothing. Humans were guests here. It was not his place to question the conclusions of older, wiser species. Later, during a shared meeting between coalition scholars and human representatives, the tablets were mentioned again. A senior alien researcher explained that the symbols had been analyzed for centuries with no success. He stated clearly that the matter was closed. Some mysteries, the researcher said, exist only because there is nothing to find. Many nodded in agreement. The human representatives did not argue. They had been warned before arriving that challenging long-held beliefs would damage trust. Humans were still earning their place. After the meeting, the archive remained as it always had, silent, forgotten, and dismissed. But something had changed. For the first time in centuries, a new species had seen the tablets not as a failure but as a question. And while most humans accepted the official explanation, a few could not forget the patterns carved into the stone. The scholars believed there was nothing left to learn. They did not know that the tablets had been waiting, not for smarter minds or older civilizations, but for eyes willing to look at them differently. Alan did not expect much when he received his assignment. The notice was short and plain. He was to assist with digital archiving in a low-priority section of the Grand Archive Station. No discoveries. No research credit. Just organization and record checking. It was work meant for someone quiet, patient, and easily ignored. That suited Alan well. He was not a famous scientist. He was not even a researcher. He was a data clerk, trained to sort information, clean old files, and make sure records matched physical items. Humans had offered clerks like him to the Coalition as a sign of cooperation. Most alien scholars accepted the help without interest. On his first day, Alan was led into the tablet archive. The lights were dim and the air was still. The shelves stretched farther than he could see, each holding stone tablets sealed behind clear panels. A supervising alien explained the rules in a flat voice. Do not remove tablets without approval. Do not question classifications. Do not waste time analyzing symbols. Alan nodded and listened. He always did. When the supervisor left, silence filled the room again. Alan stood alone, surrounded by artifacts older than any human city. He felt small but not afraid. He activated his workstation and began his task. His job was simple. Check each tablet's digital record, confirm its location, and update condition reports. He moved slowly along the shelves, scanning tablet codes and comparing them to the database. Most entries were brief. Origin unknown. Purpose unknown. Symbols non-linguistic. Analysis complete. Again and again. At first, Alan worked without thinking. But as hours passed, he found his eyes drifting back to the symbols themselves. Each tablet had long lines of markings carved deep into the stone. The shapes were sharp and clean as if cut by a precise tool. They were not decorative. There were no flourishes. No images. Just symbols. Alan paused in front of one tablet longer than necessary. He leaned closer, careful not to touch the case. The symbols were arranged in rows evenly spaced. Some shapes repeated often. Others appeared only once. There was order here. Clear order. Alan frowned. He had seen this before. Not these exact symbols, but the idea behind them. Years ago, before joining the Coalition program, Alan had studied basic human history. Not for glory, just out of interest. He remembered learning about early counting systems. Marks carved into bone, lines scratched into stone, simple shapes used to track time, food, or distance. Before modern numbers, humans had counted with patterns. Alan shook his head slightly. He told himself not to get distracted. The Coalition scholars had studied these tablets for centuries. They knew far more than he did. Still, the feeling stayed. As he continued his work, Alan began to notice small details. The spacing between symbols was not random. Some gaps were wider than others. Certain symbols always appeared at the start of a row. Others never did. On some tablets, the symbols grew more complex as the rows continued, then reset. Alan stopped again. He checked the database. The tablet he was viewing had been scanned many times, but no one had recorded symbol spacing as relevant. That surprised him. Spacing mattered in many systems, not just language. He felt a quiet pull in his chest. Curiosity. The kind that would not go away. During his break, Alan sat at his workstation and pulled up high-resolution scans of the tablet. He did not open any restricted tools. He simply looked. He zoomed in, measured distances between symbols, counted repetitions. His heart beat a little faster. The patterns were consistent. This was not art. Art did not repeat like this. Art did not follow strict spacing rules across hundreds of tablets found light years apart. Art did not care about precision. Alan remembered his lessons about early human math. Tally marks. Base systems. Counting cycles. He remembered how ancient humans had used simple shapes to represent large ideas. What if the scholars were wrong? The thought felt dangerous. Alan was no one important. Questioning centuries of expert opinion was not his place. He closed the scan and returned to work. But the idea followed him. Over the next few days, Alan continued his assignment. Outwardly, he did exactly what was expected. He checked records. He updated logs. He followed every rule. Quietly, he began to notice more. Some symbols always appeared in groups of the same size. Some tablets showed the same sequences but in different lengths. Others had symbols that acted like separators, dividing rows into sections. Alan started writing notes for himself. Nothing official. Just thoughts. Counts. Observations. One evening, when the archive was nearly empty, Alan allowed himself a small test. He took a sequence of symbols from one tablet and assigned simple values to them. Not real numbers, just placeholders. Then he mapped the spacing. The result surprised him. The structure held. He tried again with another tablet from a different system. The same rules applied. Alan leaned back in his chair, breathing slowly. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with understanding. These symbols followed logic. Not language logic. Mathematical logic. He did not know what base system they used. He did not know what the numbers represented. But he knew one thing with certainty. These tablets were counting something. Alan did not tell anyone. He knew how the scholars spoke about the tablets. He had heard the words, meaningless, decorative, solved. He was just a clerk. If he spoke now, he would be ignored, or worse, removed from the archive. Instead, he kept working. At night, in his small quarters, Alan replayed the symbols in his mind. He remembered how humans had once been dismissed by older species. How often humans had been told they were too young to understand the universe. And yet, humans had always counted. They counted stars, days, heartbeats, losses, hopes. Numbers were simple, honest. They did not depend on culture or belief. They only depended on order. Alan felt something shift inside him. Not pride. Responsibility. If these symbols were numbers, then they meant something. And if they meant something, ignoring them was no longer harmless. The scholars believed there was nothing left to learn. Alan knew they were wrong. And for the first time in his quiet life, he wondered what would happen when the galaxy finally learned how much it had overlooked. Alan did not plan to test his idea at first. He told himself that noticing patterns did not mean anything. Many people saw patterns where none existed. The galaxy was full of mistakes made by curious minds who believed too quickly. Alan did not want to become one of them. Still, the thought would not leave him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the symbols. Straight lines. Sharp angles. Repeating shapes. He saw the gaps between them, the way some rows felt complete while others felt unfinished. It was like hearing music that stopped just before the final note. After several days, Alan made a quiet decision. He would test one simple idea. Just one. Not to prove anything to others, but to prove something to himself. He waited until his shift ended late in the station's artificial night. Fewer scholars were awake then. The archive logs showed little activity, and no supervisors checked the data terminals at those hours. Alan followed every official rule about access, but he used his allowed tools in ways no one had bothered to forbid. He returned to the same tablet that had first caught his attention. He pulled up the full scan and placed it beside scans of two others from distant systems. Different locations. Different discovery dates. Same symbols. Alan started small. He numbered the symbols by order of appearance. The first symbol became 1. The next different symbol became 2. He did not assume meaning, only sequence. Then he mapped where each symbol appeared in every row. The result made his breath slow. The order stayed the same. No matter which tablet he studied, the same symbols appeared in the same relative positions. Some always came early. Some always came late. Some never stood alone. This was not how pictures behaved. This was not how art worked. Alan leaned closer to the screen. He remembered something from his studies of early human math. Before zero was understood, ancient humans still counted. They grouped marks. They repeated symbols to show growth. They used position to change meaning. Alan adjusted his test. He treated the symbols not as separate pictures, but as values based on where they appeared. The first symbol in a row mattered more than the last. Spacing changed weight. Repetition increased size. When he ran the conversion, the output appeared on his screen as a long string of numbers. Very large numbers. Alan stared at them, unsure what to feel. They were too large to represent simple counts like days or objects. Some values stretched longer than anything used in modern trade systems. Others repeated in steady steps, growing by exact amounts. His heart began to beat faster. He checked for errors. He checked again. Then again. The math held. Alan pushed his chair back and stood up. He walked a short circle around the workstation, hands pressed together, breathing carefully. He was afraid to feel excited. Excitement could cloud judgment. He returned to the screen and tried a different tablet. Then another. The numbers changed, but the structure stayed. These were not random values. They were precise, clean, intentional. Alan felt his hands begin to shake. He realized what frightened him most was not that the symbols were numbers. It was what kind of numbers they were. They were not small. They were not casual. They were the kind of values used for distances, energy, mass, time. Cosmic values. Alan remembered how scholars spoke about the ancient civilization that created the tablets. They called it lost, primitive, unimportant. A culture that left behind art but no knowledge. Alan now knew that was wrong. This civilization had understood the universe deeply enough to record it in numbers that lasted across millions of years. They had chosen a system that survived language, culture, and memory. They had trusted math. Alan sat down slowly. He thought about why no one else had seen this. The answer felt simple and heavy at the same time. Other species learned numbers differently. Their math grew alongside advanced tools, machines, and symbols that quickly replaced older systems. Humans were different. Humans remembered their beginnings. They remembered counting on fingers, on stones, on marks carved into wood. Human history carried a long memory of simple math used before comfort and technology. Alan realized that what others dismissed as too simple, humans recognized as familiar. He ran one final test. He took a sequence of numbers from a tablet and applied them to known star charts. Not exact maps, just rough alignment. He did not expect much. The result made his breath catch. The numbers lined up with known stellar distances. Not perfectly, but close enough to be impossible by chance. Adjusted for scale, the alignment improved even more. Alan felt cold. This was no longer a theory. This was proof. The tablets were not art. They were records, measurements, instructions, messages written in the only language the universe never forgot. Alan closed the program and wiped the temporary files from his workstation. He sat still for a long time, staring at the dark screen. His reflection looked back at him, pale and unsure. He was a clerk. A quiet man with no power and no voice among giants. What he had found could change everything. Or it could destroy his career if handled wrong. Fear crept into his thoughts. Fear of being laughed at. Fear of being ignored. Fear of being removed from the archive and replaced by someone who would never look twice at the tablets again. But another feeling rose beneath the fear. Duty. Those who created the tablets had trusted that someone, someday, would understand. They had waited across time and space for a mind willing to see numbers where others saw nothing. Alan whispered to himself, barely loud enough to hear. I see you. His hand still shook as he stood and prepared to leave. The truth was too large to carry alone, but he was not ready to share it yet. He needed to be careful. He needed to be certain. He needed to find a way to show the truth without being dismissed. As the archive lights dimmed further and the station entered its rest cycle, Alan walked away from the shelves of stone tablets. They no longer felt silent. They felt patient. And Alan knew, with a clarity that made his chest ache, that once the truth was revealed, the galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. Alan waited longer than he wanted before speaking. He spent days checking his work, then days more checking it again. He tested different tablets, different symbol groups, different ways of counting. Each time the results stayed the same. The symbols behaved like numbers. Strong, clear numbers that did not break under pressure. When Alan finally requested a review session, the archive administrators were surprised. No one requested meetings about the tablets anymore. Still, rules were rules. His request was approved and forwarded to the academic council. The meeting room was large and cold, built for species twice Alan's size. Long tables curved in a wide circle. Holographic screens floated in the air, glowing softly. Scholars from many worlds attended, some in person, some through projections. Most of them already looked bored. Alan stood alone at the center. He felt every eye on him. A senior scholar spoke first. The scholar's voice was calm but distant. Alan was asked to explain why he believed a closed subject needed reopening. Alan swallowed and began. He spoke simply. He explained patterns, repetition, spacing, order. He avoided emotional words and focused on process. He showed images of tablets. He showed how the symbols repeated across systems. He explained how he assigned values and tested structure. At first the room was quiet. Then someone laughed. It was not loud, but it broke the tension. Another scholar shook their head. A third spoke, saying humans often misunderstood non-human art. One called the theory creative but untrained. Another said Alan was confusing coincidence with meaning. The laughter spread. Alan felt heat rise in his face, but he did not stop. He moved to the next part of his presentation. He showed number outputs. Large values. Clean sequences. He explained how they matched known physical scales. The scholars grew more amused. One asked if humans always believed stones could speak. Another suggested Alan had spent too much time alone in the archive. A third said the symbols had been tested for centuries and humans had no reason to assume they were the first to understand them. Alan's voice grew quiet but steady. I am not saying the symbols speak, he said. I am saying they count. That caused more laughter. The lead scholar raised a hand to quiet the room. He thanked Alan for his effort and said the council would review the data later. His tone made it clear that the meeting was over. Alan felt something tighten inside him. This was the moment he had feared. The moment where truth failed because of pride. He had proof, but proof meant nothing without action. Before he could speak again, the doors at the far end of the room slid open. A human woman stepped inside. Her name was Sarah. Sarah was a technician assigned to ancient systems maintenance. She worked with devices no one used anymore, keeping them stable even though no one believed they would ever function again. She was practical, calm, and known for following instructions exactly. She had been listening outside the room. Sarah walked forward without asking permission. The room fell silent, not out of respect but surprise. Humans rarely interrupted council sessions. She looked at Alan and gave a small nod. Then she turned to the scholars. "There is an unused device in Storage Hall 7, she said. It was recovered from the same sites as the tablets. The council marked it inactive. A scholar replied that the device had no known interface and no readable language. Sarah nodded. Yes, that is correct. She gestured to the floating screens. Alan's numbers matched the input structure of that device. The room stirred. The lead scholar frowned. That device has never responded to any test. Sarah's voice stayed even. It has never been tested with numbers. There was a pause. A long one. The council debated briefly. Some argued it was a waste of time. Others said there was no harm in proving a human wrong one final time. In the end, permission was granted. The device would be brought in. The machine arrived on a grav platform. It was smooth, dark, and shaped like a broken ring. No symbols marked its surface. No buttons. No screens. It had been called ceremonial. Decorative. Sarah moved to its side and connected a simple input pad. Alan's heart pounded. He passed her the data set with shaking hands. She did not ask questions. She trusted his work. The scholars leaned forward, some smiling, some bored, some annoyed. Sarah entered the first sequence. Nothing happened. A scholar chuckled. Sarah entered the second sequence. The machine made a sound. It was soft, low, and steady, like a deep breath taken after a long sleep. The ring began to glow faintly from the inside. Light moved along its curve, following invisible paths. The room went silent. Sarah entered the full sequence. The machine responded instantly. Light flooded the ring. Holographic symbols burst into the air, forming grids, lines, and shapes too complex to mistake for coincidence. Energy readings spiked across every sensor in the room. The device was active. Fully active. The scholars froze. Data streamed across the screens. Measurements, calculations, models of stars, distances, and forces. Everything matched known physics, then extended beyond it. Alan felt tears burn in his eyes. He had been right. The lead scholar stood slowly, disbelief clear on his face. He whispered something in his native language, then looked at Alan. "These symbols," he said carefully, "are instructions." Alan nodded. "Yes." Another scholar spoke, voice unsteady. "They were waiting for numbers." Sarah stepped back from the device. They were waiting for someone who knew how to count the old way. The laughter was gone. In its place was silence filled with awe and fear. The machine continued to operate, calm and patient, as if it had never doubted it would be understood. As if centuries of ignorance were only a short delay. Alan stood very still. He was no longer invisible. The galaxy had just learned a hard truth. They had not failed to understand the ancient symbols because they were too complex. They had failed because they were too simple. And humanity, once mocked, had remembered how to see them. The days after the machine awakened were quiet in a strange way. There was no celebration, no loud announcements sent across the galaxy. Instead, there was careful movement, lowered voices, and long hours of study. The scholars who once laughed now watched every screen with deep focus. Pride had been replaced by caution. Alan spent most of his time in the archive again, but things were different now. He was no longer ignored. Scholars followed him, asked questions, and waited for his answers. It felt unreal. He was still the same person, still a clerk at heart, but the weight of what he had uncovered pressed on him every moment. Sarah worked beside him. She handled the ancient device while Alan worked on decoding the numbers. They spoke little, but they understood each other well. Both knew this discovery was bigger than either of them. The machine did not speak. It showed no words, no images of faces or places. Everything it revealed came in the form of values, ratios, and structured outputs. To many scholars this was frustrating. They wanted messages, stories, explanations written clearly. But Alan understood. "These are not words," he said quietly during one long session. "They never were." A nearby scholar frowned. Then what are they? Alan looked at the flowing numbers on the screen. Knowledge, he said. Just not wrapped in language. As the decoding continued, patterns emerged. The numbers described relationships, how energy flowed, how matter formed, how space bent and shifted. They showed systems, not statements. Processes, not commands. Anyone who understood the math could follow the logic step by step. The ancient species had not written books. They had written rules of the universe. Alan realized something that made his chest feel tight. Language was fragile. It changed. It broke. It depended on culture, sound, memory. Numbers did not. 2 plus 2 would always be 4 no matter who counted. The ancient species had known this. They hid everything in math, Sarah said one evening watching a model form in the air. They didn't want their knowledge to die with their words. Alan nodded. They expected language to fail. That idea unsettled many scholars. Entire civilizations had been built on language. Stories, laws, traditions, all depended on shared meaning. To imagine a people who trusted only numbers felt cold and distant. But Alan felt respect. The numbers revealed technology far beyond what the coalition had imagined. Not weapons, not domination tools, but understanding. Ways to move energy without waste. Methods to stabilize stars. Systems to predict cosmic collapse long before it began. One sequence described how to slow entropy in closed systems. Another showed how to store information without decay. These were not inventions made for power. They were solutions made for survival. Alan noticed something else. There were gaps. Places where numbers stopped, then resumed later with slight changes. It was like reading a record interrupted by disaster. The ancient species had not finished everything. They had left work incomplete. They were running out of time, Alan said softly. A scholar asked, time for what? Alan did not answer right away. He did not want to guess. But deep down he felt the truth forming. As more sequences were decoded, a clearer picture appeared. The ancient species had faced a repeating cosmic event, one that returned on a cycle far longer than any single civilization's lifespan. When it came, it erased worlds. Not through violence but through slow collapse. Stars dimmed. Systems failed. Life faded. The numbers described it calmly, without fear. This was not a warning written in panic. It was a record left by those who accepted reality and chose to prepare others. The scholars struggled with this idea. Some denied it. Others argued the data could be misread. But the math was steady. It did not bend to opinion. Alan saw the irony clearly. The ancient species had trusted future minds to understand them. But only humans had recognized the language they used. Not because humans were smarter, but because they remembered simpler ways of thinking. Humans had once lost libraries. Lost cities. Lost entire histories. They had learned painfully that words could vanish. Numbers remained. One day, a senior scholar asked Alan a question that surprised him. Why humans? The scholar asked. Why not us? Alan thought carefully before answering. Because humans expect to forget, he said. So we build things that can be remembered again. The room stayed silent. As decoding continued, the coalition began to change. Research priorities shifted. Old assumptions were questioned. Humans were invited into rooms they had never been allowed to enter before. Not as helpers but as equals. Alan did not feel proud. He felt humbled. The ancient species had not chosen humans. They had simply left the door open. Humans were the first to notice it. Late one night, Alan stood alone in the archive looking at the stone tablets. They no longer felt mysterious. They felt patient, like teachers who never raised their voices. He placed his hand against the glass case, not touching the stone, just close enough to feel its presence. You knew words would fail, he whispered. But numbers stayed. The galaxy had searched for meaning in stories, art, and symbols. The truth had been there all along. Counted. Measured. Waiting. And for the first time, humanity was not the youngest voice in the room, but the one that finally understood what the silence had been saying all along. The coalition did not change in a single moment. It changed slowly, the way large things always did. Meetings lasted longer. Reports were rewritten. Old conclusions were marked with careful notes instead of confident statements. Words like impossible and meaningless began to disappear from official records. Alan watched this from a distance. He was invited to many discussions, but he rarely spoke unless asked. He preferred listening. The scholars who once laughed now argued with each other, not about whether humans were right, but about how much they had missed. Entire fields of study were reopened. Ancient artifacts once locked away were brought back into the light. The coalition had believed intelligence followed a clear path. Older species were wiser. More advanced technology meant deeper understanding. Long history meant greater truth. That belief was breaking. The tablets and the machine had shown something uncomfortable. Intelligence did not always grow forward. Sometimes it circled back. Sometimes it survived only by remembering the beginning. Humans became part of every major research group. Not because they demanded it, but because the work stopped making sense without them. Where others looked for complex meaning, humans asked simple questions. Where others searched for language, humans searched for structure. Sarah noticed the change before Alan did. "They're listening now," she said one day, watching a council session from the back of the room. Alan nodded. "They're confused." "Yes," she said. "But they're learning." New projects began across coalition space. Old ruins were scanned again, this time with numerical analysis as the first step. Data once ignored began to connect. Patterns emerged across star systems, linking civilizations that had never known each other. The ancient species was no longer seen as lost or primitive. They were seen as careful. The coalition learned that the ancient people had not tried to preserve themselves. They had tried to preserve understanding. They accepted that civilizations ended, but knowledge did not have to. This idea spread quietly. Education systems changed. Young scholars were taught to study not only advanced models but simple foundations. Counting systems, early measurements, primitive tools. Things once dismissed as childish were treated with new respect. Humans were no longer underestimated. They were still not the strongest. Their fleets were smaller. Their territory was modest. Their history in space was short. But something had shifted in how others looked at them. Humans were reliable. They remembered. Alan was asked once if he felt proud. He thought about it for a long time before answering. "No," he said. "I feel careful." The scholar asking the question looked confused. Alan explained. "When you realize how much can be missed," he said, "you stop feeling proud. You start feeling responsible." The Coalition Council made an official statement months later. It acknowledged that prior evaluations of human cognitive value had been incomplete. It praised humanity's unique relationship with foundational knowledge systems. The statement was polite, measured, but the meaning was clear. Humans mattered. Alan returned to the archive often, even when his presence was no longer required. He liked the quiet. He liked being near the tablets. They felt less like artifacts now and more like old friends who had finally been heard. One evening, a young alien scholar approached him. The scholar held a small data pad and looked nervous. "I was told you might help," the scholar said. Alan smiled gently. "With what?" "These symbols," the scholar said, showing an image from a newly discovered site. "They look simple. Too simple. Everyone else says they are nothing." Alan studied the image. He saw the spacing, the repetition, the order. "They're not nothing," he said. "They're waiting." The scholar hesitated. Waiting for what? For someone patient enough to count. Across the galaxy, more machines awakened. Not all of them worked the same way. Some revealed models. Some revealed equations. Some only confirmed ideas the coalition already knew. But all of them shared one truth. The universe could be understood. Not through dominance. Not through pride. Through structure. Alan often thought about the ancient species in quiet moments. He wondered what they had been like. What they had felt as they carved the last symbols into stone, knowing they would not be there to explain them. He imagined their hope was not loud or dramatic, but calm. Someone will understand. Humanity had. And in doing so, they had changed the future without conquering a single world. On the day Alan retired from archive service, there was no ceremony. He preferred it that way. Sarah walked with him through the long halls one last time. "Do you think they planned for humans?" she asked. Alan shook his head. "No. I think they planned for thinkers." Sarah smiled. "And we happened to qualify." Alan stopped at the entrance and looked back at the endless shelves of stone. The coalition had once believed intelligence was proven by complexity. Now they knew better. Sometimes, the most important knowledge survived because someone remembered how to start from one. And then two. And then three.